In this connection is an amazing incident which happened just previous to my release. I was talking with Dr. Ingram about many things, and at last told him what I thought would be the result of a fire. The nurses were expected to open the doors, he said. But you know positively that they would not wait to do that, I said. And these women would burn to death, he said. He sat silent, unable to contradict my assertion. Why don't you have it changed? I asked. What can I do? He replied. I offer suggestions until my brain is tired, but what good does it do? What would you do? He asked, turning to me to proclaim the proclaimed insane girl. Well, I should insist on them having locks put in, as I have seen in some places that by turning the crank at the end of the hall you can lock or unlock every door on one side. Then there would be some chance of escape. Now, every door being locked separately, there is absolutely none. Dr. Ingram turned to me with an anxious look on his kind face and asked slowly, Nellie Brown, what institution have you been an inmate of before you came here? None. I never was confined to any institution except boarding school in my life. Where then did you see the locks you have described? I had seen them in the New Western Penitentiary at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But I did not dare say so. I merely answered, Oh, I have seen them in a place I was in. I mean, as a visitor. There was only one place I know of where they have those locks, he said sadly, and that's Sing Sing. The inference is conclusive. I laughed very heartily over the implied accusation, and I tried to assure him that I had never up to date been an inmate of Sing Sing or ever visited. Just as the morning began to dawn, I went to sleep, and I did not see many moments until I was rudely awakened and told to get up. The window being opened and clothing pulled off me, my hair was still wet, and I had pains all through me, as if I had rheumatism. Some clothing was flung on the floor, and I was told to put it on. I asked for my own, but was told to take what I got and keep quiet, and by the apparently head nurse, Miss Grady. I looked at it, one underskirt made of coarse dark cotton goods, a cheap white calico dress with a black spot in it. I tied the strings of the skirt around me and put on the little dress. It was made, are all those worn by the patient, into a straight tight waist sewed onto a straight skirt. As I buttoned the waist, I noticed the underskirt was about 6 inches longer than the upper, and for a moment I sat down on the bed and laughed at my own appearance. No woman ever longed for a mirror more than I did at that moment. I saw the other patients hurry past the hall, so I decided not to lose anything that might be going on. We numbered 45 patients in Hall 6 and were sent to the bathroom, where there were 2 coarse towels. I watched crazy patients who had the most dangerous eruptions all over their faces dry on towels, and then saw women with clean skins turn to use them. I went to the bathtub and washed my face at the running faucet, and under my skirt did duty for a towel. Before I had completed my ablutions, a bench was brought into the bathroom. Miss Group and Miss McCartan came in with combs in their hands. We were told to sit down on the bench and the hair of 45 women was combed with 1 patient, 2 nurses, and 6 combs. As I saw some of the sore heads combed, I thought this was another dose I had not bargained for. Miss Tilly Maynard had her own comb, but it wasn't taken from her by Miss Grady. Oh, that combing! I never realized before what an expression "I'll give you a combing" meant, but I knew then. My hair, all matted and wet from the night previous, was pulled and jerked, and after expostulating to no avail, I set my teeth and endured the pain. They refused to give me my hairpins, and my hair was arranged in 1 plait and tied with a red cotton rag. My curly bangs refused to stay back, so at least was left of my former glory. After this we went to the sitting room, and I looked for my My companions. At first I looked vainly, unable to distinguish them from the other patients, but after a while I recognized Miss Maynard by her short hair. "How did you sleep after your cold bath?" I almost froze, and then the noise kept me awake. It's dreadful. My nerves were so unstrung before I came here, and I fear I shall not be able to stand the strain. I did the best I could to cheer her. I asked that we be given additional clothing, at least as much as custom says women shall wear, but they told me to shut up, that we had as much as they intended to give us. Chapter 13. Choking and beating patients. Miss Tilly Maynard suffered greatly from cold. One morning she sat in the bench next to me and was livid with the cold. Her limbs shook, her teeth chattered. I spoke to the 3 attendants who sat with coats on at the table at the center of the floor. "It's cruel to lock people up and then freeze them," I said. They replied she had on as much as any of the rest and she would get no more. Just then Miss Maynard took a fit, and every patient looked frightened. Miss Neville caught her in her arms and held her, although the nurses roughly said, "Let her fall on the floor and it will teach her a lesson." Miss Neville told them what she thought of their actions, and then I got orders to make my appearance in the office. Just as I reached their Superintendent Dent came to the door, and I told him how we were suffering from the cold and of Miss Maynard's condition. Doubtless I spoke incoherently, for I told of the state of food and the treatment of the nurses and the refusal to give more clothing, the condition of Miss Maynard, and the nurses telling us because of the asylum was a public institution we could not expect even kindness. Assuring him that I needed no medical aid, I told him to go to Miss Maynard. He did so. From Miss Neville and other patients I learned what transpired. Miss Maynard was still in the fit, and he caught her roughly between the eyebrows and thereabouts and pinched until her face was crimson from the rush of blood to the head and her senses returned. All day afterwards she suffered from terrible headache, and from that on she grew worse. Insane? Yes, insane. And as I watched the insanity slowly creep over the mind that had appeared to be all right, I secretly cursed the doctors, the nurses, and all public institutions. Some one may say that she was insane at some time previous to her consignment to the asylum. Then if she were, this was the proper place to send a woman just convalescing to be given cold baths, deprived of sufficient clothing, and fed with horrible food. On this morning I had a long conversation with Dr. Ingram, the assistant superintendent of the asylum. I found that he was kind to the helpless in his charge. I began my old complaint of the cold, and he called Miss Grady to the office and ordered more clothing given to the patients. Miss Grady said if I made a practice of telling, it would be a serious thing for me. She warned me. People in the world can never imagine the length of days to those in the asylums. They seem never ending, and we welcome any event that might give us something to think about as we talk of. There is nothing to read, and the only bit of talk that ever wears out is conjuring up delicate food that they will get as soon as they get out. Anxiously the hour was watched for when the boat arrived to see if there were any new fortunates to be added to our ranks. Then they came and were ushered into the sitting room. The patients would express sympathy to one another for them and were anxious to show them little marks of attention. Hall 6 was the receiving hall, so that was how we saw all newcomers. Soon after my advent, girl called Urena Littlepage was brought in. She was, as she had been born, silly, and her spot was, as with many sensible women her age. She claimed 18 and would grow very angry if told to the contrary. The nurses were not long in finding this out, and then they teased her. "Urena," said Miss Grady, "the doctors say that you are 33 instead of 18, and the other nurses laughed. They kept up up this until the simple creature began to yell and cry, saying she wanted to go home and that everybody treated her badly. After they had gotten the amusement out of her they wanted, and she was crying, they began to scold and tell her to keep quiet. She grew more hysterical every moment until they pounced upon her and slapped her face and knocked her head in a lively fashion. This made the poor creature cry the more, and so they choked her. Yes, actually choked her. Then they dragged her out to the closet, and I heard her terrified cries into the smothered ones. After several hours' absence, she returned to the sitting room, and I plainly saw the marks of their fingers on her throat for the entire day. This punishment seemed to awaken their desire to administer more. They were returned to the sitting room and caught hold of an old gray-haired woman whom I have heard addressed both as Miss Grady and Miss O'Keefe. She was insane, and she talked almost continually to herself and to those near her. She never spoke very loudly, and at the time I speak of was sitting harmlessly chattering to herself. They grabbed her, and my heart ached as she cried, "For God's sake, ladies, don't let them beat me." "Shut up, you hussy," said Miss Grady as she caught the woman by her gray hair and dragged her shrieking and pleading from the room. She was also taken to the closet, and her cries grew lower and lower, and then ceased. The nurses returned to the room. Miss Grady remarked that she had settled the old fool for a while. I told some of the physicians of the occurrence, but they did not pay attention to it. One of the characters in Hall 6 was Matilda, the little old German woman who I believe went insane over the loss of money. She was small and had a pretty pink complexion. She was not much trouble except at times. She'd take spells when she would talk into the steam heaters or get up on a chair and talk out the windows. In these conversations she railed at the lawyers who had taken her property. The nurses seemed to find a great deal of amusement in teasing the harmless old soul. One day I sat beside Miss Grady and Miss Group and heard them tell her perfectly vile things to call Miss McCartan. After telling her to say these things, they would send her to the other nurse, but Matilda proved that she, even in her state, had more sense than they. "I cannot tell you, it's private," was all she would say. I saw Miss Grady, on a pretense of whispering to her, spit in her ear. Matilda quietly wiped her ear and said nothing.